Most of you will remember when this happened. It was a little over 30 years ago. The Vice President of the United States was Dan Quayle. Some of you already know where this is going, don't you? He was visiting a school. Children were having a spelling bee, and the word was potato. 12-year-old boy said P-A-T-O-T-O. And the vice president said, no, that's not right. It has an E on the end. Well, Dan Quayle was wrong. And the boy was right. And this became the fodder for the late-night comedians and for absolute ridicule of the vice president. And he's still going and very active now at age 77, but for the rest of his life, he had to live with this shadow that he wasn't very smart. Now, that incident, however we want to evaluate it from all this many years on, seems like child's play compared to what can happen now. With everything ramped up and complexified by digital and social media and now AI. A cascade of misinformation, falsehoods and lies, and misrepresentation. You know that you only need to have a few seconds of your voice recorded, just a few seconds, and AI can take that and replicate you saying anything. And it will sound exactly like you. What I'm trying to say is whether it's in that very high-tech way or in which is probably not where most of us have to live, but even in the old-fashioned things like whisper campaigns and rumor mills and gossip lines, words really matter. Words really matter. All of us, I'm sure, are carrying around some things that have been said to us or about us that were hurtful. And we just have a hard time shaking them. They got stuck inside of us. All of us are probably carrying around things that we said that we regret. We wish we hadn't said. Or something that we should have said and we didn't, and we regret that. Words really matter. They can be hurtful. They can also be helpful. Most of us are probably carrying around somewhere inside of us something that someone said to us that was just the right thing at the right time, for whatever reason. And hopefully we carry within us something that we said to someone that made a positive difference to them. What's really interesting is one of the sayings amongst preachers is that the sermon is what you said plus what they heard, and they aren't always the same thing. And I find that about sermons. Someone will come to me and say, years later, say, I remember when you said this in a sermon, and I certainly don't remember saying that. And I probably would not have said that, but that's what they remembered. And this happens in our personal conversations too. I find it interesting that many times some people will say to us something that we said to them maybe years ago, a positive thing that really helped them, that was really encouraging, that made a difference, and we can't remember at all that we said that. But the point is that words really matter to us. And James, good old James, who we're hearing from all this month, James who, whether he was actually Jesus' brother or not, I like to imagine that he was. The practical one, the one who has the pragmatic wisdom all throughout this letter that we're hearing from during this month. James talks about words by using the image of the tongue. He says it's such a little thing, but it makes such a huge impact. And he said we seem to have pretty decent success at taming all kinds of things, but the tongue seems to be one thing we can't tame. And we try. I think most of us try. We'll go into a conversation saying, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to, and then we say it anyway, right? Or something just blurts out in a reaction, and it can't be taken back. We immediately know we shouldn't have said that. We wish we hadn't said it. Tongue just seems to be somehow untamable. That's just part of the reality of life as we live it. So is there anything that we can do to make it better? We can't absolutely tame the tongue. Can we make this better? Think through a few things. One is just to remember to take care with our words. Remember that they do matter. Sometimes it's about what we take into ourselves. Probably not too many of us here can be accused of this, but it's very easy nowadays to spend your entire day, or at least hours upon hours, just scrolling through the internet about all kinds of things. Taking all kinds of stuff into ourselves we can't possibly process. We can't possibly process it all. But it gets in there. And it's part of our inner conversation. And we might find ourselves reacting in one way or another to just the stuff that we're carrying inside. And so some people say, just limit that. Just limit the amount of sources, for instance, that you take news in from. Try to get a few that you feel you can trust. Maybe a few that will offer some different points of view and not just one. And just get enough and then let that be enough. Just take a walk instead of spending another hour doom scrolling. That's one thing we can do. So that perhaps we'll be less likely to react against things, and sometimes putting us in a mood that, I well remember 8 years ago, it has nothing to do with the election, it has to do with the Cleveland Indians losing the World Series. I was in such a bad mood about that, that about a week later, I snapped at somebody who absolutely didn't deserve it. And I realized later it was because I was carrying that around inside of me, that poor soul. So be attentive not only to what comes out of us, but what also is going in. And perhaps remember sometimes to take the initiative to say something positive. I wish I were better at this myself, but I'm very impressed at how many people who are substantial major leaders in all kinds of fields, politics and other things, still write handwritten notes to people. They might sit down at the end of the day and write a stack of handwritten notes, whether it's a birthday or saying, hope someone's doing better, whatever, and you know what a difference that makes. Something just like that, to balance the untamable part of the tongue. James says earlier in this letter, he says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Some of you may have had a parent or a grandparent who put it much more simply. God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. The other thing we can do is, in addition to just taking care and remembering to take care, the other thing we can do is to join Peter in his confession. The gospel today, it's a turning point in Mark's gospel. It's a before and an after. Everything leads up to what we hear today, and then everything flows from that. This is when Jesus finally gets the disciples away from everybody and says, who are they saying that I am? And they have all kinds of answers to that. But then he turns to the really direct question, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. Call that Peter's confession. Not a confession of sin, but a confession of faith. Jesus, you are the Messiah. And we can join in that kind of confession. We do that when we come here. We say the creeds, we sing the hymns, we say the prayers. Sometimes people will criticize Episcopalians and say, why do you only use prayers that are in a book? Well, most of us don't only use prayers that are in a book, but sometimes those prayers know better than we do what to say. And they give us language, they give us words. They help train our words. They also influence us inside. So we can join in that confession and all of those great words of the church, because they will point to something that is even a greater word. And that is the Word of God. John's Gospel begins this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then a few verses later, that word that was in the beginning, that's with God and is God, that Word became flesh and lived among us. That's Jesus. And then it says about that Word that is God, who was there from the beginning, who was made flesh in Jesus, that Word is full of grace and truth. And so that Word of God is full of grace for us in love and acceptance and forgiveness, even with our untamed tongues. And James says in his letter, encourages us to receive with meekness the implanted Word, which is able to save our souls. I looked at that pretty closely and I realized it's not saying open up and receive the Word. It's saying open to the Word that is already in you. It's been planted in you. This Word of God from the beginning, which became flesh in Jesus, which is full of grace and truth, has already been planted in us. And James is saying, receive it, open up to it. Receive with meekness. Among all the words that are out there, among all the words that we say that we wish we hadn't said, or that we wish we had said, or that we're glad we said, or whatever, amongst all of those words, there is this word. Receive with meekness the implanted Word, which is able to save your souls. One more week to poke around in the letter of James. This letter that was written it simply says from James, or Jacob, which probably is closer to the way it would have been said in his day. It's a very common name. But as I have said, the early Christians just assumed without any doubt and question that this James was James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church in Jerusalem after Jesus' resurrection. And as always happens nowadays with scholars, there's lots of different opinions about whether it was really that James or not that wrote the letter. But one of the scholarly opinions continues to be that it was. So I'm happy to go with that myself and willing to be wrong, because I think it's interesting to think that this is actually Jesus' brother who wrote this letter, and this letter that was intended to be circulated not just in Jerusalem but beyond, because James was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, we might say the first bishop of Jerusalem, and he had a concern for the region and for the Jews in the region who were becoming followers of Jesus, and they really didn't know what to do. All of this was brand new to them. And he was trying to help them with sort of kind of the practical nuts and bolts of being a congregation and the relationships within a congregation. So today, we hear him saying, those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Now, he was undoubtedly talking about conflicts and disputes within congregations. We never heard of that in our day. Thankfully and mercifully, we're not going through any conflicts and disputes in this congregation. We're in a pretty happy, peaceful season, but we all know that those things come and go, and who knows why sometimes. And so James is saying those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? And he says in this section of the letter that they come from things like envy and selfish ambition and greed. And those things inside of us fester, and then they become conflicts and disputes outside of us. Now, I think that's often true. If James were here, I would like to give him a few but what abouts. But what about when the structures and systems themselves are unjust? And some people, through nothing that they did or nothing that they earned or deserved, have advantages, and other people have disadvantages. And maybe sometimes the disadvantaged push back, and there are conflicts and disputes. Or what about when people have conflicts over things they genuinely believe to be right? Two different views of what's right that are in conflict. When we give the most charitable interpretation to both sides, that's what's going on in the abortion debate. One side sees it as a matter of protecting human life from murder. The other side sees it as we're not sure when human life begins, and so we want to protect human freedom to make choices. Both of them believe that they're right. And they come into conflict and dispute. So I think James would say, you're right, there are more reasons than the one I gave in that letter. I was addressing things that I knew were going on in congregations, but I think what I have to say can apply to all kinds of conflicts and disputes, no matter where they come from. So he says about them, show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. What a great phrase, gentleness born of wisdom. Now, we might think that gentleness means being weak or wimpy, but I don't think it does. I think gentleness here means being more fully human and humane. I mean, to use the old categories of a world that is kind of slipping away, when we said that a man was really a gentleman, we didn't mean that they were weak and wimpy. We meant that they had a full humanity and a kind of humane sensitivity to other people in their bearing. The same thing would be said about women. So I have a great example. The manager of the Cleveland Guardians. I know it's 2 weeks I've had Cleveland baseball images, but you know the playoffs are about to begin and we're in the playoffs, so who knows how much I may care. But last week, after they won a game at the end in a dramatic way, and he was giving his press conference, he just got choked up. He said, I love these guys. And he cried. Now, was that weak and wimpy? Or was that being more fully human and more fully humane and actually being strong? So that's what I hear when I hear this phrase, see that your good life, show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. And then James goes on to say what the wisdom he calls the wisdom from above, the wisdom that comes from God is like. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And the important thing to remember here, that this is not some kind of test that's set up for us to try to accomplish. This is the wisdom of God for us. even in our imperfections and conflicts and disputes. This is the wisdom from above that is for us before it is any wisdom that is in us by God's gift. Well, sometimes it takes more than words to get the point across. So when we go to the gospel today, Jesus is now at the point where his face is set toward Jerusalem. He has the disciples privately as they're going along the way. He doesn't want to be amongst the crowds right now. He wants to teach them privately what is going to happen. And he says to them very clearly, several times, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to suffer and die, and then I'm going to rise again. And they absolutely don't get it. It doesn't fit anything that they had come to expect. They don't get it. They don't even dare to ask him any questions about it. And to show how much they don't get it, while they are walking along and he's teaching these things, they're in the background having an argument with each other about who is the greatest. Now, I happen to think the only person who ever really kind of had the right to say, I am the greatest, was Muhammad Ali. Because that served a purpose in what he wanted to portray. But you know, how far away are they from what Jesus is saying, that the way that was coming was the way of the cross, and for them to be arguing about who is the greatest. And so he knows that his words are just not getting through, and he needs to do something else. So he grabs a kid, a child, and puts this child in front of everybody and says, this is me to you, this child. Now, we could get the insight of the parents who were here, but we have in our culture, we've sort of inherited a Victorian romantic view of children, that they're always wonderful. And they are often wonderful. But they're not always wonderful. In Jesus' time, there was no sense at all that children were wonderful. They were just something that was there in the background of almost no meaning until they became adults and could work. They just weren't paid attention to. They just were there in the background. So Jesus grabs this child and puts this child in the midst of these guys who've been arguing about who's the greatest. And he says, this is me, this child that nobody even pays attention to. If you really want to be a leader, you have to be a servant. If you really want to be first, you have to be willing to be last. This is the way it works. This is the way it works. So when I imagine a child in my midst these days, of course, I think about my grandsons. Now, they're not here today, or I might not use this illustration. Because I normally don't want to embarrass them, and it's really not embarrassing, but sometimes just being mentioned is embarrassing, or sometimes they really like it. But when I think about my grandsons, I have, first of all, what I think of, I call the grandson test. When I think about a public figure, whether they're in sports, like the manager of the Guardians or the players or any sport, whether they're in the arts, like music or the movies or theater, whether they're in politics. My grandson question is, do I want my grandsons to look at that person and be inspired and say, that's what I want to be like? That's my grandson test. And when I put one of them in front of me, it changes, doesn't it? It changes how you look at things. Jesus knew what he was doing. I want them to look at any public figure, and then I have to admit to look at me and see gentleness that's born of wisdom. That's what I want them to see. Doesn't mean that person has to be perfect. Doesn't mean that person has to be pious. It means I want them to be human and humane. That's what my grandson does. So earlier this week, we had the boys and we took them to their cross-country meet down in Edinburgh, and at the end of the meet, I was putting the little guy into a seat in the back of the car, and I said something in the sentence that had the word wisdom in it. And he said, "What's wisdom?" And his older brother said, "Well, wisdom is like knowledge." And I said, "It is. Wisdom is like knowledge, but knowledge is knowing about something, and wisdom is knowing what to do." So James calls us to show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom. And we can seek that wisdom. At the beginning of his letter, James says, if you're seeking for wisdom, if you need wisdom, ask God. God will give you wisdom. You might not get the whole package of wisdom from above that he mentions as being God's wisdom, but you'll get the wisdom you need. Just ask God for wisdom. And at the end of the passage we heard today, he reaffirms this confidence by saying, draw near to God, and God will draw near to you.